AI promised to transform business, but for most companies, it's been chaos. Leaders spend millions, teams spinning in circles, and almost nothing makes it into production.
Somewhere between 5 and 8% of Gen AI initiatives are working.
You're creating a monster. Then you're going to create all this human work to evaluate the mistake that your monster made.
I was talking to a bank that had more people reviewing the Gen AI outputs than they had originally producing the output they were trying to replace with Gen AI. It's not going to integrate into the business. That's why you see so many proof of concept prototypes that really don't materialize, is you don't have an operator whose entire initiative set is designed to drive it.
In this episode, you'll learn the playbook to actually operationalize AI, how to measure results, build the right team, and avoid wasting millions.
My advice to people is always, if you want to get it working, take your best operational person, take your best operator, and give them the Gen AI initiative.
Our guest today is Matt Fitzpatrick, CEO of Invisible Technologies, one of the fastest growing AI companies in the U.S. With revenue as an organization that jumped from 2.4 million to 134 million over just 4 years. Stick with us. In the next few minutes, you'll learn how to define what success actually means when it comes to AI and how to validate it safely before it creates a mess and structure teams to scale without ballooning headcount. What has been the most surprising thing you've learned from building and scaling organizations across your career?
Interesting question. When I was at McKinsey in the early days, this was probably 10 years ago, the firm had less than 100 engineers when I started building AI there. And I think by the time I left, I had about 7,000. I oversaw a pretty good chunk of those. It was interesting in the early days, we didn't really have any idea what we were going to build. As I thought about building AI, it sounds so obvious now. Like AI is such an exciting topic. Everyone wants to talk about it. You can't open a paper without seeing 15 articles on AI. But, 10, 12 years ago, people were pretty skeptical of AI. And I think maybe Palantir was probably the only company you really ever saw anyone talk about that mentioned the word AI. And so I had to try and think about what I wanted to build, how to build it, and how to make sure that it was something that people would want in a vacuum of knowledge, is what I would call it. Like without really any view of where you were going to end up finding product market fit.
It's like building AI for AI's sake and hoping that there's going to be an application, a payoff with all this money that was going into it.
Well, yeah. And I think now, you can, there are 50 articles on which use cases by which topics, but I remember sitting in a conference room, sometime like 2015 being like, could we apply AI to credit applications? Where would it be interesting? Like where in financial services would people want to do it? And I think the biggest thing I learned a bunch of different things from that. I think one is that the loudest voice is often, if not always, wrong. I think it's been one of my guiding leadership principles is you have a lot of time, like leadership indexes on charisma as a modality that people value. And so the louder, more charismatic people are who you want to listen to. But I will say over 10 years of kind of scaling that from scratch, the loudest, most charismatic people were often wrong in what they told me would work versus some of the quieter people that were doing interesting research that actually would kind of surprisingly find product market fit. And so I think I spent a lot of time thinking about how to create space for discussion and formats where people who are thinking deeply but not speaking loudly would have a venue to talk. I think particularly in a research context, and particularly in an AI research context, that is very much the case. So I think that was something I learned a lot about. I also learned I'm a pretty big football fan, and Nick Saban talks a lot about the process, right? And I do think like the process is a true concept. Like you can try and focus on indicators like revenue, but in a lot of ways you have to make sure you have a process to discover what might work, who you hire. So that's all true. But I think the other thing I'd say is that Nick Saban did not build Alabama football with the process. He built it with recruiting. And
don't tell him that.
No, but I mean, look, he recruited the best football players in the country, and then he built something good for it. And I think, if you take my first point and then pair it with the second, with the recruiting concept, like most of what worked, I can tell you, I did hundreds of meetings where I thought we would have a product people be interested in, and we got nowhere. And the thing that worked more than anything else was hiring really great people and just getting lots and lots of reps with customers. And I think that if you get enough good people having enough meetings, listening well rather than talking, like if you do a lot of listening with a lot of good people, it's a pretty good recipe to find product market fit. And so I think that's been my my biggest learning over time is listen more and recruit great people. And if you do those two things, you're in a pretty good place.
Man, that is so powerful. And in a world of AI where things are moving so fast, it's easy just to sort of type something in, hit enter, and boom, there you have it. Let's move on it. And you're really flipping the script on that. You're like, no, hire great people, but also pair that with deep thinking and letting them really sit on the questions, think deeply about the customer's product market fit, and then draw that out of them, right? What they're learning and that deep thinking, and that can ground your approach to success and building teams and even AI.
Yeah, I think we're a very human-centric AI company in the sense that, like, I'll give the example of like AI sales agents, which have become like the new thing. I don't think they're going to work at all in a lot of ways. I actually think that humanity becomes even more important in a world where you're getting 15,000 emails from sales agents. And so personal connections, listening, I think really, really does matter more now than ever when people are overloaded with kind of inbound inquiries. And so, yeah, I do think it is all about kind of people and listening in a lot of ways. And, the other funny thing is in a decade at McKinsey, I met a lot of CEOs, over various topics, many of them thinking about AI, things like that. And I always found there was an interesting, I can't say it's a perfect correlation, but there was almost a perfect correlation between the style of how those meetings went and I'm not going to say share price growth, but like what was really interesting is there's kind of two types of meetings you have with people at AI. In one type of meeting, and this sounds bizarre because in many ways they were asking like kind of my advice for how to help them and anything else like that. And like the model we were doing, right? We had 4 deployed engineers, we were building things. And so we would come in and have lots of conversations in my McKinsey days on like what you could build. But in half the meetings, people would spend the entire meeting telling me how successful whatever they were building was. And it was really interesting. Like, and I'm not going to make a judgment on it, but it was like almost them telling me why everything they were doing across the company was working. And in the second type of meeting, which I would say very closely mapped to all the stuff I saw work, it would almost be a skeptical tone of like, let me listen to you and understand whether you can tell me something interesting about AI. And I'm going to treat you as like an information input that I'm going to consider or not. But I'm not going to like, I don't need to tell you or brag to you at all. I just want to know whether what you have is interesting. And so I think there's actually even on the customer side a degree to which this is true, which is like I see the numbers, right? I know that if you look at the math, and there was the MIT study last week on it, somewhere between 5 and 8% of Gen AI initiatives are working. So the vast majority of companies are really struggling with this. And I think the listening modality is not only true for me as a person building a company, but very much true for those trying to explore how to make this stuff work.
Oh, so powerful. I love the idea that you've seen, or at least it maybe not be a drill down like randomized study, but you have noticed that companies and CEOs that tend to listen more have better outcomes for their organization. And maybe if that's how they approach their business and their meetings, that's a lot of times culture comes from the top. And so how other people show their organization.
I think the reason that that's probably the case in this era, and I'm not saying that, like, I'm just saying what I've observed is this is a lot more complicated than like a perfectly accepted process. Like I'm going to say like lean manufacturing, there was a way to do it. It was pretty clear. You had to learn it. You had to execute it. AI is much more discovery based. It's hard. It's complicated. It requires like organizational navigation. And so, yeah, I think there is a degree to which in all contexts involved in it, listening is the most powerful way to figure out what you might change and where the problems might be.
Well, so talking about AI, Matt, what is getting lost? A CEO can go do great things personally on Chat GPT to plan their vacation, to plan their speech to investors, but then have a big enterprise AI project that's frustrating, messy, costly, and ultimately fail. What is getting lost here?
Yeah, look, I mentioned the MIT study, and I think you have the following cognitive dissonance, right? So if you look at model improvement, and we trained a lot of the big large language models, like there is no doubt that in the last 3 to 4 years, the performance of the large language models has multiplied by orders of magnitude. And anyone who's used any of them, you can be amazed at what you can ask them and how impressive the answers are. So the technology has gotten infinitely better. And then you have the fact that there was a study recently that if you looked at like the Y Combinator startup classes, the last 2 classes on like a 6 and 12-month revenue basis are the largest revenues ever for Y Combinator classes using a lot of AI tooling. So the technology works. And then you have the enterprise side of the house where, the MIT study was, only 5% and Gen AI shows any return on investment. And there's other things that only 60% of models make it to production. So you've had basically a large scale failure modality so far in implementation of this. And what I would posit is that's actually not a tech challenge in a lot of ways. I think it's a couple different factors. The first one is data. So, and obviously this is something we spend a lot of time. Our data platform, Neuron, is very focused on this. But, if you have 50 different underlying systems, ERP systems, CRM data, contact center data that's unstructured. If you have fragmented data across all the enterprise, across your full enterprise, it's not organized in any format, you can't really do AI, right? I have a joke that when good AI meets bad data, the data usually wins. You can't really take messy, unstructured, non-useful data, bring it together and do useful AI conclusions. Because take a simple example. Like if I have a customer record that's different across 2 ERP systems and I try and do a recommendation for a price or a cross-sell idea for a customer, well, guess what? My 2 customer IDs don't even sync. So it's definitely not going to work if I can't unify, does a customer buy one product from me in system 1, one product from me in system 2? And so I think data has been the untold big obstacle for this. Like 70% of software in America is over 20 years old. And that kind of layers of sediment mess has been really complicated, right? That's one.
That's big because if you think about that, that's a huge differentiator. The enterprise solutions are failing while you can still use it successfully in your personal life, because for enterprise stuff, you got to have a lot better data to put in there. It's got to be customized. And if you can literally just throw stuff into ChatGPT for an email, but there's a big jump to make. And am I right too that it accelerates exponentially with AI? Like you make one mistake in an enterprise platform, and you've set yourself back.
If your data is wrong, if your data is wrong and you're multiplying the use of that data with AI, you're actually it's almost, bad data at the speed of light. It doesn't work at all. It's really bad. So I think the data challenge, you're right. That's why the consumer side of the house has had so much more adoption. Because if I'm a consumer asking questions using, my data is pretty clean and pretty simple. And so I can get the models to do amazing things. If my data is sitting all across, and I think that's why the core of our business in a lot of ways is Neuron. It is this data platform that we don't do AI unless we can work off of structured, clean data that we help build out. I think the second big challenge is measurement. And, Ben, I'll give you this example because it's a funny thing that this is a lot of what Invisible spent the last 5 years. It was a lot of what attracted me to joining Invisible. It's a lot of what we spent the last 5 years doing is measuring and statistically validating whether AI works or not. And what I'd say is that machine learning over
what does success look like?
Yeah.
When it's an infinite
and I'll tell
game.
you why that's harder. Machine learning has a pretty well understood paradigm for what good looks like. Like you can back test a credit decision and you can look at historical credit decisions and you can say, okay, my credit decision is good or bad. clear, right? Where this gets a lot more complicated in Gen AI context is like, let's take that same credit decision. And then let's say I want to apply it to 10,000 credits and I want to generate memos on those credits. So I want to generate memos that say, here's why I came to the credit decision. Here's the logic behind it. And here's the fact base to say good or bad. Now, let's say you did that for 700,000 credits. In the yes, no decision on, is this a good or bad, should I accept it? Clear. But let's say you had to generate, several thousand credits with 25 pages per memo. And let's say I asked you to bet your annual bonus on whether that memo was good for all 7,000 credits. Mm-hmm. How would you know that was right or not?
Yeah. How do you know? If it complaints?
Right. Well, so good luck. So the idea of like, okay, I'm going to launch it in the wild and hope people complain and use that as a measure. People have tried that, by the way. And I think that's why you've seen some really public rollbacks of Gen AI initiatives is people try and do that. They're like, oh, I'm going to just launch it in the wild and then see if I get complaints. And that's a disaster. Is avoiding disaster the real measurement of success you want to have as a CEO? I hope not. I remember I was speaking to a player who had rolled out an agent in their contact center system, and I asked them the definition of success, and they were like, "Well, we're roughly syncing it on like are the calls resolved quickly, and does this consumer generally seem happy?" And I said, "Well, what if the model hallucinates and gave them an 80% discount, and then the call ended? Like they're happy, it gets resolved quickly. It's a horrible."
I love this company.
Yeah. So the way I think about it is actually the process of setting up like an eval to say what should be a good outcome for that credit. How do I do reinforced learning, human loop feedback to do like, does this look good on a statistically representative sample, and then get you to a point where you feel comfortable pushing that model into the wild and knowing it works and being comfortable, you bet your bonus. I think that's been the big second challenge is how do I validate. Because I think the enterprise really needs to know that if they're going to launch, and I mean the enterprise broadly, like any top 10,000 company, your failure mode is not like, does it kind of work? It has to work with an equivalence level of like a very good human. And so, I think that's the challenge.
Or better.
Right? And
like this right here is like, we have a lot more to cover, but the value of this interview is already so high for leaders, right? Get off your AI tool and think about what success is and how you're going to measure it. And don't use it. Don't use it until you identify that. Otherwise, you're creating a monster that can literally eat your company because you could spend all this money on your AI tool and it's generating all these results. And then you're going to create all this human work to evaluate the mistakes that your monster made. And you've lost all the benefit. Am I right?
I was talking to a bank that had more people reviewing the Gen AI outputs than they had originally producing the output they were trying to replace with Gen AI. And I was like, this is self-design. And so I do think like the validation process is the key part. So data is one, the definition of correct and how you validate it's the second reason you've had challenges. And then the third reason, which, I think this is a phenomenon that's not really broadly understood, but I do think it's a core part of this is what I'll call like the IT manager syndrome, or the fact that like, you're a company, like you're an industrial distributor, right? And you've heard that Gen AI matters. Your board is putting pressure on you to focus on Gen AI. And so you're like, I have to make progress. What's the natural place that I should locate my Gen AI initiatives? And so your answer becomes your IT manager. Now, the challenge with that, and this is not true of all companies, but it's true in I think a very large chunk of these examples is like, often that IT function's goal has been security, it's been data validation, it's been infrastructure, but it's not been like validating and deploying models to run a contact center, right? And I think that's been, and by the way, these are people that like might not have experience with Python, might not know Rust, they might not know any of the languages it relates to. And so, and a lot of the time the IT function, particularly in non-digitally native businesses, is not, it's not really integrated with the business on operational examples. If I take the credit underwriting example I gave earlier, like your credit underwriting team, your business team is not really day to day working with the IT function. And so I think there's a huge organizational challenge to Gen AI so far in the enterprise, which is like my advice to people is always, if you want to get it working, take your best operational person, take your best operator and give them the Gen AI initiative. Like figure out 2 to 3 things you want to bet on, take an operator and give them the Gen AI initiative you're trying to drive. If you push it just to like my IT function is going to run it, it's not going to integrate into the business. And I think that's why you see so many proof of concept prototypes that really don't materialize is you don't have an operator whose annual bonus and whose entire initiative set is designed to drive it. And I think that's why a lot of the digitally native, like Y Combinator businesses have been so successful with it is, this is something that like people who are really intellectually curious, even if they have not come from a technical background, if you're a really good operations person, you can figure out how to make a ton of progress, particularly with all the new tooling. Like anyone who's used any of the Gen AI programs can get pretty comfortable with it. You don't need to have an IT background day one. And so I do think this is about who is your leader that's going to drive it. I think that has been the other big challenge. And that should be somebody that you really believe is one of your best operational people.
So important for people to think about. Okay, we talked about success and defining that and evaluating it. But maybe even a bigger issue is where you're leaving all of your AI initiatives to IT and they don't speak the language of everybody else in the company. And to get the opportunity and to deliver the ROI, you've got to make progress in all these other areas. And if all they know is software and not the operations, it's a complete, it's just going to be disjointed and it's not going to be successful. And I love the fact that you're like giving us that guidance. Hey, identify your top operations people and start there because they understand the flow, they understand the communication, they speak HR, they speak product, they speak IT, they speak the language across the organization, and they're uniquely equipped to make enterprise progress.
Yeah, and just let me follow up on one thing you said because it's really important. The point about buying software. I think this is the other part of that to extend what you just said a little bit more. 5-7 years ago, you had a very distinct choice, which was like, do I buy software or do I build? And the definition build back then was like from scratch, build a really complex custom system, which was like I had to hire 100 engineers. It was really expensive, really complicated. Like Gen AI is neither of those modalities. And I think that's something people are still getting comfortable with. Gen AI is actually a mix of using an incredible amount of existing tech, whether it be cloud data, whether it be large language models, that trillions of dollars of investment have gone into, but then stitching it together to build out a business process. So that's actually not buying software. So you're an IT function that's bought software before. It's not that. And it's not building something from scratch either. It's really figuring out operational process design using a broad suite of tools. And it is much more of a COO function challenge in a lot of ways for those reasons.
Referring back to the initial study that you mentioned, MIT, that so many initiatives from AI are considered not being successful in companies. As I recall that study, it sounded like the ones that did have benefit and the leader said, hey, this benefited my company, they were more on the operations side of the house. And the ones that failed more often, sales and marketing related. What's your thought process on why that is? Same things that we've already talked about, or something unique going on there?
I think actually I would there's a selection question there, which is part of that is that internally focused operational stuff has by definition less risk because you don't have to expose it to customers. Customer focused sales and marketing stuff means you have to push out to customers. So my comment there would be actually both of those are business leaders, but I think it's a confidence question of like, if you give the example, like let's say you're a designer goods company, right? You have an incredibly close relationship with customers that you really value. What is the hurdle for you to push a mass outreach Gen AI generated startup communications to them? It's very, very, very high because the risk of that going wrong is very, very bad. And so I do think that's the challenge. And I see this too. Like I think most of the interaction and use cases getting traction in the enterprise so far are supply chain, contact centers, coding, things that are more operationally centric where you don't have risk if you deploy them in the same way.
So good. All right. We don't have a lot of time left, and I've got a lot more questions. So I'm gonna have to prioritize this. But I mentioned in the introduction, Invisible's been on a absolute tear. 2.4 million to 134 million in 4 years. What was the inflection point of what of what happened with that growth? And with you at the helm, where are you planning to take this thing?
Yeah, so I think, look, Invisible's history is interesting. Over time, if you take 6, 7 years ago, what the company had built was effectively a couple different things. One, an AI process platform or an AI software platform that could take any complex process and move it to a series of discrete steps, effectively a digital assembly line. It had built this expert marketplace where we could source really complex expertise anywhere in the world, and it had built an amazing kind of operations team to manage those three. And so we could take really insanely complex processes and work through them. Now, I joined the company in January, so what I'm going to talk about between the period of 2020 and 2024 was not me, but I'll tell you what I observed when I was thinking about joining was, the company benefited from, as the AI boom took off, it moved from serving just large enterprises to all the model training, kind of AI training for all the model builders, right? And that became this incredibly sophisticated, what's now called AI training. There's 2 or 3 other companies that are also quite large that do it. And we benefited from, we're an infrastructure layer company in AI. Like, we benefited from, I'd say, massive growth in that space, and then being able to do something incredibly sophisticated with really high degrees of accuracy based on a mix of technology, people, and processes. And so you can say it was a mix of really unique capabilities, market tailwinds, and an amazing team.
You're like the perfect storm of opportunity is how it looks like. You're like, hey, we've been working on this for a while. They brought you in too, right? You've been working in the field before it was a field back over at McKinsey.
Yeah. Well, so that's the interesting thing. And so, what Invisible had built over that time was the ability to source on 24 hours notice, like 15 PhDs in computational biology and, 12 Turkish language tax experts, like whatever the random topic was anywhere in the world. We had a kind of integrated pipeline to source, evaluate, test, and then deploy that group and with high degrees of accuracy. And that was something I thought was incredibly unique that kind of had evolved and been built out. Now, I think the complexity to that and what attracted me to it, and I think part of why they reached out to me about it in the first place, was you do have challenges with hyper growth where it's kind of like what got you here will not get you to the next 5-10 years, the next S curve. And so I think if you scale at that rate, you actually do have to go look back at your entire operational stack from first principles and say, what are going to be the rate limiting factors? What do I need to rebuild from the studs? What might not work? What processes might I need? What I might need to change? And so it was a really interesting challenge when they approached me of like, look, we've gotten to this place. We have an incredible capability set, incredible set of technology, a great team. But we want to take that next S curve and go, from 134 to 500 million to $1 billion in revenue. And what do we need to do to get there? And so I thought that was an incredibly exciting challenge to me. I'd spent the last decade, for a couple of years there, nobody thought it was great. Then it became the topic everyone was interested in. And I, look, I think the chance to lead an AI company in probably the most interesting time, and I think this is one of those interesting times in business history in a lot of ways. If you look at the amount of excitement, capital, and interest going into the space, that was an incredibly exciting proposition to me. And what I'll say is, I thought there was varying degrees of different capability sets Invisible had built out that I thought were incredibly difficult to replicate and that I could magnify. I think that the tech stack and process platform was incredibly interesting. The institutional memory of the operations team in particular, like there's I don't know if have you ever read the 7 Laws of Power?
Yes.
Okay. So in that book, he talks about like different types of moats businesses build. And he gives the example of the Toyota production system. And the reason he says really interesting is like, if you actually take the Toyota production system, they've actually exposed it. They'll like give the instruction manual to everyone and say, try and replicate it. And you can't do it. You actually
don't do it. You're right.
With every piece of context, you can't replicate it. And so that was actually, if I looked at a mix of kind of the tech stack, the customer base, and then the institutional memory, I just thought it was an incredibly difficult thing to replicate because 5 years of scaling and training AI in the formative years of it, every difficult question across every topic, the institutional memory you build from that and the expertise set is incredibly difficult to replicate.
It's so interesting. We're talking about institutional memory, and AI feels so new-ish right now. But it really goes to show too, and I'm thinking about people inside their organizations, you need people with institutional memory to really implement effectively AI, because they're going to understand the data sets more. They're going to understand the people who own those. And if you're creating a churn and burn atmosphere of turnover, or you're just going out and you're firing a bunch of middle management leaders, and yes, we know that is happening right now, you're getting rid of some of the institutional knowledge that could be a great accelerator for your AI.
Yeah, and look, I think I had no involvement in this, so I can talk. I'll just take my way in from the sidelines of what I've observed. Like, I thought the Klarna example was incredibly interesting in this, right? Probably the most public example of a company going out and saying, like, we're shifting our contact centers to AI. And then a year later, 6 months later, coming back and say, okay, we're going backwards. We're all back to humans.
Whoops.
And
please come back. Please.
What you just said is key there. I think that my guess is there was some institutional memory somehow that got lost in how those interactions were happening in the process of using AI. And so I think institutional memory is an incredibly important part of this. I think culture is an incredibly important part of this. And like, one thing I've observed going back to the CEOs I have conversations with is if the CEO, this has to come from the top. If the CEO of any company is not fully bought into saying, how do I fully step change and drive this top down myself? It's really hard for kind of 1,000 bottoms up initiatives to ever get tracked.
All right. So let's press on here, because we ain't got much more time, and this could literally go on all day. There's a lot to talk about here. So you mentioned, hey, you've been in this new role for 7 months. Think about your first 90 days as CEO. What was the boldest decision you made, and did it work?
Yeah, I think the craziest thing I did was eliminating almost the entire organizational structure. And I say that somewhat controversially, is like, that's not to mean we don't have any kind of reporting relationships at all, but I think there's a typical organizational design that's been popularized over the last 30 to 40 years. A lot of the time it's related to like factory-based businesses where you have physical presence, which is like, I have a bunch of managers that manage silos, and each of them is given full autonomy and they run their thing. And then those people all make decisions, right? And so you have siloed control. Now, I think what I observed when I came into Invisible is you had a mix of managers of lots of different topics paired with products and tech being built, paired with functional expertise like operations. And so you had these like weird matrix decision-making structures in all situations where, because the company had scaled so much, every decision required like 9 people to weigh into it, partly because you had everyone leading some different thing. And so one of the things I thought a lot about, I read The NVIDIA Way, which I think is one of the greatest business books written on how flat NVIDIA has stayed as it's scaled over time. Like, basically almost everything is groups of people collaborating very organically to build new things. And that's a lot of how they've been able to evolve so quickly. And so that's a topic I've been thinking a lot about. And so one of the biggest changes we made is we do not emphasize kind of hierarchies and P&Ls. Like, the minute I talk to an interview, they're like, I want to run a P&L. I'm like, great. Like, that's not going to be us. But that doesn't mean people can't have tons of responsibility. You can have people overseeing 50 client relationships. You can have people building incredibly interesting products, but everything actually comes about cross-functional collaboration. So the simple model that we have is that each customer has teams that lead it, and they have full autonomy to lead those customer teams. And then you have lots of different self-organizing product teams, research teams. And so it runs much more like a research hub with customer relationships. And I think what that's done is flattened the entire organization. I also do no one-on-ones with anyone in any form. So I have no like inner circle leadership team at all. Yeah, it's a really interesting.
So you've got 1,000 people reporting to you. Correctly.
Well, yeah, I mean 380, but yeah, I think an enormous percentage of that group technically reports to me. And the way I think about it is, what that actually means is I have functional meetings with groups throughout, and stuff is pushed forward, but anything that's an issue, I resolve it very quickly. but there is no, and people have autonomy to lead their products, to lead their customer relationships. It's not like I'm in the weeds debating all that stuff, but there is not these siloed structures or these competing cross-functional teams. It's an organizational design to allow for research, collaboration, thought, product development, and then most of all, though, it's incredible customer centricity. So every customer relationship has a clear ownership team that reports to no one but themselves. And their job is to use the mix of technology and support across to deliver that.
So you made this change. It is a bold one.
Yeah.
How's it worked?
Look, I think it has worked really well. I think, time will tell over time, but I think if you are a customer-centric organization, I read a lot about different organizations. And
how have you seen it show up? Like you're like, hey guys, guess what? We're about to flip your world upside down. You all report to me. I know it's not exactly like that, but yeah. How have you seen it show up? Like, oh yeah, okay, it's working. Or, oh my gosh, people are extremely confused because they don't know how to operate this way.
Yeah, well, I'll give you like like one of my first weeks, and then where this ended up to. I remember it was like my fourth week, and we had a large customer that was we were doing a deployment for and a kind of an AI training project for, and the thing is, we had the platform was being deployed there, so it was a large product team, there was an operations team, there was an account team that worked with them. We were doing some research efforts with them. So I remember I called up the and we had a bit of an issue one day. And so I was like, all right, so who's in charge of that account? And the answer I got was, well, there's the product lead, there's the operations lead, there's the client lead, there's and then each of them has a boss. So it's like 8 people. And I was like, it can't be 8 people. And this is, I think, the challenge with P&Ls is that when a P&L is a single product company, it works. Mm-hmm. But when a customer situation is like a discovery-based AI thing with 14 different components and 4 pieces of tech, and like, who owns that situation? And so I tried to do a group meeting, and there were like 19 people on the phone. And I was like, this does not work. And so the big thing I changed was I was like, there's going to be one leader of each account. And that person has autonomy over, like, they run the account. And then everything else is functional. It's tech-based. Like the tech teams, there are clear owners of every product. And that's all matrixed into the accounts. But like, again, I read a lot about a lot of different organizational structures. I think ServiceNow is a business that's done this incredibly well. If you read about ServiceNow, they're incredibly obsessed with customer centricity. Like, I think there's a joke that, if a customer tells you to put a chair on the table, you put a chair on the table. That was like one of the kind of longstanding things there. And I think and it's kind of like the absurdity if you still do it. I think we approach things the same way, which is like, our customer teams are what matters for us. Like they like, we do whatever customers want, and we support customers however we can. And everything we build feeds into that, but there's no like P&L leader in the same way. And I think that's how AI companies have to run. Like, you have to start customer back with customer needs and make that the central theme. And then all the functional support and all the technology support feeds into that. But it can't be like fiefdoms and power structures in the same way. And I think that's just a legacy of like a world when, I think really it's a legacy, like pre-internet world of like, I had 15 factories where I had to do phone calls and I couldn't run them myself. So I had P&L owners around those factories. But our digital assembly line is global, and it's different. Email based, it's different.
Yeah, I love that. And it sounds like you got some congrats on making a bold move and actually have it work. Sometimes it's like, oh my gosh. But also, you do a lot of reading. You're on top of things, and you see the things the way they're headed. And we as leaders, as the world accelerates from a change in technology standpoint, we've got to stay on top of these things. And I love the idea of flattening. It's, I think it sounds like it's worked really well. There's a big change component, so I'm sure there's been some muddiness getting to that area.
There's definitely been muddiness, and I won't pretend it's been. I think there's actually a lot of muddiness in the early days of it. But I'll tell you, one of the things I've mentioned a lot with it is like, our North Star as an organization. I mentioned people. It's like, our number one goal as an organization is to recruit exceptional people. Full stop, right? And so if I start with like Nick Saban, not the process of recruiting, like, if our goal is to recruit the best engineers in the world, the best operations people in the world, the best product people in the world, one of the challenges of that is like, I think really amazing people don't love to reporting to six other people. Like no truly exceptional person wants to be the sixth person down in a hierarchy, right? I mean, they might say they
Yeah.
do, but they don't.
Mom, I became the assistant to the assistant manager today. Finally.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so
How much money did you get? No more money.
yeah.
Just I got a new business card.
And so one thing I noticed was really interesting is every time I talked to a really exceptional person, they were like, I want to report to you. And so I was kind of like, look, like I actually understand this. I understand that like people don't want to be layered down 15 levels and there's not actually a reason to do it. And so my modality is I want to recruit self-starting entrepreneurs that want to build things. And if you want to build a new supply chain management system or whatever that is on our platform set, come do that. And I can hire 500 amazing entrepreneurs that all want to build their own things, that all want to be autonomous and don't have to fit within these fiefdoms of P&Ls.
So good, man. Matt, it has been a fun one today. What a great place to land the plane because we hit so many things about AI, helpful ideas, talked about listening, which is going to catch a lot of people off guard. They're like, okay, this is the AI leader who listens, but also making bold decisions in an environment that requires it. And I think a lot of people are going to benefit from that. And we're clearly going to have a second interview. So
I would love that.
looking forward to it. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate you having me on and great to chat.